Of AML Conversations. I'm John Byrne with AML Right Source. Today we have with us Dr. Mohamed Lazzouni. Doctor is with Aware. He's the Chief Technology Officer at Aware. He's had a whole host of positions in technology for many, many years, and we wanted to talk to him today about how the AML community could be better equipped to deal with all the many challenges that we have today with sanctions and terrorist financing and all sorts of money laundering related crimes and movement of illicit funds by the use of biometrics. And so, Doctor, thank you so much for taking the time today. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure to be here, Tom.
So let me start with this. Our community is small institutions, large multinationals, financial technology firms, folks from the government, and obviously everybody, hopefully at this point, has a general awareness of what biometrics are. But let's define our terms. What do you consider to be biometrics? And then we'll talk about some of the examples.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I would define it as the collection using a computer of something about you, who you are. So typically a sensor such as a camera or perhaps a voice recorder like a mic would pick up a characteristic of you in terms of human signature. So snapping the portrait of someone is capturing their face biometric. Recording the voice of someone is capturing their voice biometric. We can also capture biometrics that are rather esoteric. For example, biometrics that could capture the structure of the iris of the retina of the eye of a human being. Obviously, the DNA would be another form of biometric. One of the very famous one that is ubiquitous in the use of criminal identification would be the fingerprint, or the palm print. Other biometrics that are a little bit less popular would be, for example, the veins into the body of a human being that you can image on the backside of your hand could be unique to a human being. And then you have others that are really far-fetched and yet have their uniqueness in them as well. Believe it or not, the gait, the walking style of a human being is a unique form of biometric to people as well. So you could see that it's a rather rich myriad of signals that come from what characterizes a human being uniquely, and that called the biometric. I will touch upon the last one because most likely in the interview we will come back to it on a number of times. And that is something that sometimes we refer to as behavioral biometric, the way that on certain occasions we behave in a certain manner could be very specific and unique to us. Perhaps the most popular example that people give about that one would be the manner in which you type on your own keyboard. So your keystroke dynamic would be unique to you and certainly different from mine. So that would be a form of biometric as well.
Let me ask you a couple questions. So, as I said, the community, as you know, is very diverse in that we have small community banks that maybe have 2 or 3 branches, and you have multinationals, you have global organizations. So, some of my questions would be based on what is a practical use of biometrics. So, for example, some institutions are purely online. Right? You don't walk into a branch. There's no interaction with staff. So it's purely online. So as you're onboarding those customers from a know your customer, KYC perspective, what version of biometrics would be useful there?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would say today, the language that we use to describe a version of biometric, we would call that a modality of choice. So the modality of choice that we see most people gravitate towards is really the face modality. For a very obvious reason, because of the ubiquitous presence of a lot of the devices in the form of smartphones, tablets and things of that nature that have really an extraordinary state of the art presence of sensors that are on them, cameras that are of high resolution, compute powers into these devices. So it has become natural in terms of the use to say capture a selfie, and it has become easily available in terms of the compute power to be able to use those sensors and that compute power in order to make the face biometric a biometric of choice for a lot of the applications, essentially because you don't have to intermediate it or proctor it or work with it. You can imagine that a second close runner to that could be the voice biometric, recording a voice memo or speaking a password, which is a voice signature inside the mic, is equally low friction and equally easy to use. And you don't have to burden the user with a level of either training or knowledge of the device or the mechanism behind what happens. It becomes fairly easy in terms of lower barrier to entry.
Yeah, on voice recognition, since there are folks that use different accents, disguise their voices. How strong are the biometrics in general to play for that? So if somebody, and they may not do it just to simply open up an account, but just in general, I'm really curious because on voice recognition, given that we've all experienced entertainers that can do all sorts of different voices and things, how does the technology avoid being, I don't want to say tricked, but make sure that it's accurate? They're looking at they're assessing the voice recognition to that individual.
Yeah. So generally what happens with voice recognition is you have what is really going on is the analysis of something that is unique to you, meaning that the airways that exist inside your body, the rate at which the air is being pushed through your lungs to come out of your mouth, and the vibration of your own vocal cords, if you wish, are a number of mechanical parts that move as a function of the air that gets pushed to them, and such characteristics are unique to you. So in other words, in that sense, the voice biometric can discriminate against these things as well. But obviously, if someone, say, for example, has an accident and they might puncture the lower part of the skin in their jaw or something of that nature, which then affects the travel of that airway and affects the environment, that is going to affect the way that their voice signal is going to be picked up. Something also like, for example, sickness where the inside of some inflammation or infection might cause the inside of the throat to be shall we say swollen, will cause that signature to work in that. So that's on the variances that could cause the voice to be done. By the way, the same thing could be true of the face as well. God forbid, say that somebody has an accident and maybe they have part of the skin of their face that gets burned, or perhaps they lose an eye into an accident or something like that. That will equally affect the ability of the face recognition to perform properly. So these would be the exception cases to the scenario that would happen there. Now, I want to pick on the second point, which I thought was extremely insightful and a very good question. That is different from somebody attempting to manipulate the voice in order to do something about it. Probably because of the press, a lot of people have heard of this thing that is called voice cloning, where someone might synthetically generate a voice recording on behalf of someone and attempt to do something that is either a prank or nefarious activities based on the use of that. Now, those are now deliberate spoofing attacks that are being done on a system, and those we have deterrents that allow us to recognize a genuine voice recording from a spoof voice recording. There are some very unique signatures that we look for that will inform us on how we discriminate between one scenario and the other.
We're going to ask folks to take a look at the Aware website, obviously, if they're interested in not just this, but other things that you folks are involved in. But I want you to give, if you can, give me some examples. Going back to my original posit was, the different size institutions, just in general, companies like yourself, others that engage in producing biometric products. Are you finding in 2024 that smaller versus larger institutions are maybe not ready for that yet? Just in general, what does the market look like? I'm really curious because obviously, as I said up front, we are all being challenged more so than ever before to both investigate, report, record, be proactive in a whole host of potential criminal activities. It's a lot different from when I started decades ago. We're looking for examples of human trafficking, of elder abuse, also of identity theft, all sorts of things like that. And so obviously, multi-factor authentication, various ways of authenticating a customer on the front end could help reduce that. But are smaller institutions less likely to be part of this? I'm not asking you to give us, pricing or anything, but I'm just curious, what's been your experience since you've been in the marketplace?
We have observed the adoption of biometrics really across all of the stratifications of the sizes of businesses. So precisely because of the thing I talked about before, which is we are no longer dependent upon specialty devices or specialty software or things of that nature, given the fact that, and to use the term that most people use into these environments, you can bring your own device in order to interact with, say, the financial services institution or the test-taking institution or the website from which you would like to do online gaming. Across all of these environments here, there is no longer a need to have a specific barrier to entry that is predicated on the size of the business. And that is primarily for three reasons. One, the technology has significantly matured. The footprint of the technology is fairly small. The adoption of the integration is fairly trivial, so you can deploy these things very quickly. Two, there is no longer a unique hardware dependency. You can just use the camera and the mic on your phone, and then you are up and running because you don't have anything special. And three, which is the earlier point that you hit on correctly, whereas before it used to be prohibitively expensive to get a number of these solutions in place, today it's trivial. The business models have become highly flexible, priced per user, priced per transaction, priced on demand, priced in all kinds of ways possible, where you do not, if you are a small business, you do not have to build an infrastructure in order to manage and use biometrics. You could literally consume it on demand. You could just subscribe to a SaaS service, put that into your application, and it becomes up and running. The very final comment I'll make, which is extremely important, which is speaks to the maturity of the industry and its ability to respond to its customer needs, is also to package the needs of biometrics in easy to consume technologies. Today, for example, you could go to marketplaces and you could literally download the biometric plugin, much like you would download other plugins. You put that into your application and you could be up and running in minutes with biometrics into your workflow.
I think it's certainly obvious to me how this would be utilized this way, but let me ask you about cyber security and cyber fraud. Obviously, a major issue throughout all economies, not just the financial sector, but particularly in the financial sector, whether it's ransomware or malware, that sort of thing. How does biometrics help in that space of cyber attacks? And I'll just add one more thing. If we were talking about this issue 10 years ago, the people in anti-money laundering in the bank would not really be connected that much with the information security folks. But now that's changed because all these crimes overlap and everything is related to technology. So how does authentication by biometrics help respond to the increasing amount of cyber attacks that, again, not just hitting the financial services sector, but all the various sectors that I'm sure you folks are working with?
I would respond to this by putting it perhaps into three different categories. So I'll call it the security value chain and the attack surface, and I will position the biometrics in what I would see as being the optimal places where you can deploy it in conjunction with other security measures that are put in place in order to protect the service, the organization, the institution, or what have you. So the first one where biometrics plays a very unique role is what I refer to as the binding between the device and the person, the human being, into a unique way. So biometrics is really a very powerful key that allows you to bind the person, a physical human being, to a device. For instance, say that that there are online gamers that like very much to be over extended periods of time on gaming platforms or gambling platforms or something like that. So if you start doing tailgating, for instance, you would begin a transaction or a session, and then you would pass that device back to me after you start it, so I can play essentially on your credentials. Biometric will allow you to really disambiguate this sort of thing, because at the time of sign-in or at the time of the interaction, the biometric will come in order to verify that it is indeed you. It's not the device that's on the other end of the transaction, it's the human being that I have qualified or I have vetted and enrolled, that is the real human being who's on the other side of the transaction. So that's a unique place in which biometric offers a rather unique solution, and that is very defensible, and it's a solution for which we have needs today. Second domain or second environment in which you could apply it successfully would be the things that are very highly regulated or that require an audit, where at the time of the transaction, for example, if say for, again, to take the case of say online gaming or online gambling, if there is say an age verification requirement where you need to estimate the age and allow only people above a certain age to come into that particular environment, you clearly cannot rely merely on putting a form in front of them in which they can enter their age on an honor system. That has to be verified in some manner that would allow you that. So you could perform an age verification or an age estimation based on biometrics. So that would be a second one. And then the third and last one that I see a lot of is really on the forensic work that can benefit VIP use as well as people of concern use. You could simply have a registered database of, say, VIP users or registered databases of, say, bad actors. And if you receive somebody who attempts to impersonate someone else and you have their image into the record, then it becomes very easy to identify that person if they attempt to borrow another alias or assume another identity, because the biometric will disambiguate that identity in a very easy manner, and it cannot be fooled once you get that person properly registered and marked.
That's fascinating. I don't expect you to know the answer, and I don't either. But given what happened with the recent murder of the CEO of United Healthcare, and they obviously have identified the shooter. They found him in Pennsylvania, and somebody saw pictures. So that was sort of a basic. But it struck me as all the different ways in which surveillance programming, whether it was at Starbucks or Greyhound bus terminals, all that. So all that information becomes essential for criminal justice reforms, criminal justice. So I assume that you folks are involved with law enforcement as well as the private sector, because they need to use biometrics just as much as financial institutions do.
We do so, but we do so with a great deal of care and respect for our institutions, because we keep a very strict firewall between what we refer to as surveillance, where people might have their biometric collected unbeknown to them, and people that consent to the use of their biometric specifically for the transactions for which they feel that biometric is adding value or is adding security to their transactions. So we really belong to the domain of consent more than the domain of surveillance. This is a business choice that we have opted for, which a lot of other people in the industry have opted for. But you are correct with regard to the area or domain of criminal identification. Society is being served very well with capabilities that exist within the domain of biometric, that if somebody leaves a latent fingerprint at a crime scene, or somebody has a grainy picture into something like this, and they have done something pretty horrible, then the industry with its capabilities has the means by which we can identify a bad actor and help those that prosecute that case have the evidence that they need so they can proceed and do their part for their job to keep the public safe.
Yeah, I was hoping you go in that level, because I was going to ask you as a follow-up, but you've already talked about it. So the security and privacy is obviously so essential to making sure not only are biometrics effective and impactful, but they're not used for nefarious purposes. So companies like yourself obviously make sure that that's part of I guess part of the product, a part of the infrastructure, the privacy, as you say, it's done with consent of your clients. So that's very important, because I know, as you've just alluded to, some folks are very concerned, rightly so, about all this information that seems to be out there. And biometrics, while very valuable, can be misused. But obviously, it's something that you worked hard on to make sure there's, my words, not yours, guardrails around the use of this information.
You are exactly right. And in fact, I will add one more for consideration for your audience, is the idea that in addition to the seriousness of consent and the respect of privacy, the other one that we need to watch out for is to flush out from these systems bias, because these technologies are not completely neutral. So with things that relate to either gender bias or race bias, the last thing you want with these systems is to let them, for lack of a better term, be the ultimate arbiter of a particular decision, because this is a piece of technology that is still neutral, but it can have its own biases, essentially because they are all using the same process, which is the use of deep learning and machine learning to train these systems. So if you are not careful and diligent during the training, you could cause a system that has more bias than another system. And to your point, we take great care and have gone to extreme strides to ensure that we take out bias out of our systems, and other people in the industry do equally well to ensure that these systems, when they get used, one that relies on them realizes that inside them we don't have an issue with those systems once they get deployed in operational environments and scenarios.
Doctor, I want to thank you for taking some time. I'll get you out of here on this one. Besides onboarding, various know your customer requirements, the security of financial transactions, is there anything else in the financial side, the financial services sector side, that you would encourage folks to consider the use of biometrics? So again, onboarding, we understand, obviously making sure transactions are secured. Is there anything else in that space that also should be considered as a valuable authentication tool?
I would recommend the idea to reflect on it and consider it, that I sometimes refer to as step-up authentication. For instance, let's take a scenario that is practical into financial services. Obviously, somebody would be required, because of the security requirements of their shop, for them to begin something with their system to authenticate to that system. That's fine. So now you are following the security policy of the environment in which you work. But now say that you need to move a large transaction that is regulated, $100,000, $50,000 and whatnot. You cannot, with that entry key with which you got into the system, be allowed also to make a very high level transaction. Somehow you need to implement another requirement at that particular time in order to step up that authentication. So one of the things that we do with biometrics is to use this thing that is called multi-factor or multi-modality authenticator. Maybe you could use, say, face recognition to get into a system, but in order to make a large transfer, in addition to face recognition, you will also require voice recognition. So you could use two of them in sequence back to back in order to get a fused score that allow you to be more secure into the environment.
Dr. Mohamed Lazzouni, who's the Chief Technology Officer at Aware, thank you so much for your time. As I mentioned, go to aware.com for more information on Aware's products and services and there's some interesting blogs and releases there that further amplify some of what we've been able to talk about today. So, Doctor, thank you so much for your time.
John, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.